and welcome back to another episode of the Always About People show. I'm your host, Chris Allen, and we have a really special topic to cover today, one that is relevant in society, one that people are talking about, and maybe you don't know exactly what it means, but I promise you, you've heard about quiet quitting. It's kind of a social phenomenon at this point in time, and it was all started by a 22-second TikTok video. Now, for those of you who are watching us live right now, I know that you can catch this show every week on YouTube, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and we're glad that you're joining with us. We hope that in this show, we provide relevant content that helps you lead more effectively, helps you develop culture more intentionally, and helps you understand people more fully. We're glad that you're joining with us. And my hope in this show is that this just wouldn't be a monologue, but that we could create a dialogue, because I have more questions than I have answers right now. But our team here at Always About People has been thinking about this concept of quiet quitting over the past few weeks since it's become mainstream. Now, in this show, I want to help explain what quiet quitting really is, but then I want to question it. I want to question the validity. I want to question what it actually means, and I want to question what's really going on inside of society and in the workplace. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're joining with us. I want to remind you that you can send in questions and comments, and even though we're pre-recording this, I would love to get to any of your questions. I'd love to create a conversation in the comments. So please engage with this. For those of you who do not know what we're talking about with respect to quiet quitting, I thought I would just take a moment to show you what we're talking about. Here is the 22-second video that made
recently learned about this term called quiet quitting, where you're not outright quitting your job, but you're quitting the idea of going above and beyond. You're still performing your duties, but you're no longer subscribing to the hustle culture mentality that work has to be your life. The reality is it's not, and your worth as a person is not defined by your labor.
Well, that's it. That's the video. Those are the 22 seconds in 2022 that have created a cultural phenomenon. And the reality is quiet quitting isn't them actually quitting their jobs. It's people, a generation saying, hey, at 5 p.m., I'm not going above and beyond to do more. I'm going to do my job, but then I'm going to quit. I'm not trying to earn the favor of anybody. I'm not trying to play the game. I'm not trying to climb the ladder. I'm not really trying to even meet the expectations of my boss or exceed them. I'm going to work at my job, but I'm going to set some boundaries and some limits. Now, the way that this term has become a cultural phenomenon, though, is that we've made it about a generation. And at least the commentary that I'm seeing and the articles that are written and the people that are responding, they've turned this whole concept of quiet quitting into like, this is, wow, we've reached this new revelation. There's this new phenomenon going inside of our culture, and it's all due to this next entitled generation. I just don't believe that's true. And this is what I want to question, because we've actually seen this data for a long time. Those of you who watch this show regularly, you know that we've been looking at statistics. We've been looking at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is what's referred to as the quit rate. And really, as far back as we can go here into the early 2000s, we've seen changes in the quit rate. And right about the last recession, we began to see this quit rate increasing. And we pulled this data recently here in the month of September 2022, actually through August. And what we're seeing is that we're right in line with where we would have been had we just continued on with the quit rate, even with the pandemic. We obviously saw the quit rate decrease when the pandemic started and then dramatically increase afterwards. But you'll see that that trend line has come right back down to kind of the average here, the line of best fit. And the point that I want to make is I don't really think this is anything new. We've been watching this trend increase for a while. And in many ways, an organization called Gallup has been following this trend for 22 years. So while a 22-second video has become a cultural phenomenon, the reality is the Gallup organization has been tracking this for 22 years. Now, they've tracked it through what they refer to as their Q12 survey. It's 12 questions that measure the engagement of an employee. So while this TikTok video brings up the alliteration of quiet quitting, and it's a catchy phrase and it sticks with us, and there's actually some science behind the fact that we remember things when they're catchy. The fact that the alliteration of quiet quitting became this concept through a TikTok video, it's actually proven to stick with us more effectively than the Great Resignation, because it's not an alliteration. It doesn't have a cute way of remembering it. And what's interesting is, the Great Resignation is kind of forgotten about. That was the big topic of conversation over the past couple of years. Everybody is resigning. Everybody is leaving organizations. Now everybody is quietly quitting. But what the Gallup organization would show is this is really nothing new. In fact, in 2017, 5 years ago, they measured the engagement of the American workforce, and they found that a third of employees are engaged in their workplace, meaning 2/3 are not. And even 5 years ago, 51% of employees were actively looking for a new job or watching for openings. And that's the statistic right now that everyone is so surprised by. Wow, so many people are looking for new jobs and new opportunities. Well, Gallup just released their newest data, and what they found, released this month, September 2022, when we're recording this, the U.S. employment engagement, 32% of U.S. employees are engaged in their work, and 18% are what they would refer to as actively disengaged. Now, what the Gallup organization, way they define engagement is an engaged employee are those people who are involved in, enthusiastic about, and committed to their work and workplace. Now, on kind of as a contrast, the disengaged are people who are indifferent, sleepwalking through their workday without regard for their performance or their organization's performance. And as a result, vital economic influencers such as growth and innovation are at risk. So what the Gallup organization would say is they've seen now through the results of their Q12 survey, which are these 12 questions about engagement. Those 12 questions are broken down into 4 main categories. There's the basic needs, there are individual needs, there are teamwork needs, and there are personal growth needs. And based on the results of this survey, they show the statistics of who's engaged and who's disengaged. So 18% of the U.S. employee population are actively disengaged, leaving a 50% gap in the middle. Now, the ratio is the lowest that they've seen in a decade, and what the organization would say is, we've got an issue. There are 18% who are actively disengaged, 50% who are disengaged. You could add those together, and 68% of the U.S. employee population are somehow disengaged in their work. Now, why is that? What's actually going on? Well, I'd love to show you the data over the last 22 years from the Gallup organization. Again, we said, hey, you can watch a 22-second TikTok video and believe that there's something crazy going on in the workplace and blame a generation. Or you can look at the data from the Gallup organization over the last 22 years, and you'll see that really the 18% actively disengaged number that we're seeing currently isn't even as high as the active disengagement we saw back in 2007 and 2008. So while the trend has actually been moving upwards in terms of the percentage of engaged employees, this 22-second TikTok video on quiet quitting actually isn't revealing anything new to us. In fact, we've seen it before. This is nothing really new. Now, the interesting thing about this new recent data, though, is that the engagement and the disengagement does seem to affect younger employees under 35 slightly more. Again, according to this data from the Gallup organization, between 2019 and 2022, engaged employees under 35, the percentage dropped 6%, while the percentage of actively disengaged people under 35 increased 6%. They've also seen a 10-point drop in the scores around the questions of someone caring about them, someone encouraging their development, and having the opportunities to learn and grow. And they've also seen, for those under 25 or under 35, a 12-point drop for those who are fully remote and hybrid around someone encouraging my development. So you have a generation of people who are trying to state something. They're trying to tell us something, and they're going about it on TikTok through an alliteration like quiet quitting. But what is it that they're really trying to tell us? What is it that this should tell us about the workplace? Interestingly enough, because we're going to stick with the Gallup data, about 7 years ago, Gallup did some study on the state of the American manager. And what they found is that managers really do matter, because managers account for at least 70% of the variance in employee engagement scores. And the reality is that 1 in 2 people leave their job to get away from their manager to improve their overall life at some point in time in their career. Bottom line, engagement scores have a lot to do with my manager. Well, interestingly enough, our managers aren't really engaged. And this is data from that same research from the Gallup organization released this month, September 2022, showing that only a third of our managers are actually engaged. And so the reality is, people join companies and they leave managers, and we've got an issue in the workplace. So our managers aren't really engaged. Our people aren't really engaged. The way people get engaged is through their managers. And so we have this trickle-down effect that's happening in organizations, and people are really crying out to say, hey, I want to be valued. I want autonomy in my work. I want somebody to actually take the time to care about me. I want someone to ask me how I'm doing. I want somebody to take the time to meet with me, to care about my growth, my learning, and my development. But it begs the question, historically, what's going on with engagement in the workplace? I was talking with a few friends and even my colleagues at Always About People, and we were coming up with some ideas to test correlation between employee engagement, satisfaction, their engagement in the workplace, and potentially some other factors. Now, if you think back historically, we're going to be doing some research, but I would love your thoughts on this. I'd love for you to share any opinions you have. I'd love for you to disagree with me on this. Send in any questions, thoughts. If you have a great article or something you've read, we would love to hear about it. But the reality is, if you rewind the clock to the Industrial Revolution, Frederick Winslow Taylor developed kind of Taylorism. Modern management theory was developed out of his study around how you could scientifically engineer the roles, particularly on an assembly line, and that these types of workers, we could create greater levels of efficiency by looking and measuring everything. And an individual who was on an assembly line would go to work, they would do their job, they would do it over and over and over again, and then they would leave their work and they would find some level of happiness, satisfaction, value creation, some sort of transcendent purpose outside of work. Frederick Winslow Taylor kind of coined this idea of modern management theory, which we now call Taylorism. But I think we've carried that into some of our even most recent management theory. In the 1980s, you had some large companies, some large American companies, GM, General Motors, even Delco, who had these incredible management development programs. And they had been developing managers and helping managers understand people. And then sometime in the shift in the economy in the late 80s, early 90s, it's almost like organizations got away from that really detailed management development. And we tried to create greater levels of efficiency inside of our organizations. You know, when you need to cut spending, you look at the areas inside the business that you can cut and you reduce expenses to increase profitability. In the 90s, you had the rise of, in some ways, the private equity run. In the late 90s into the tech boom of the early 2000s. And we have a generation that's being raised as technology increases, the internet into the early 2000s with the cell phone, into 2005, 6, 7 with the rise of the smartphone. And through these technological changes, even how we've thought about the employee has changed. It was Peter Drucker who said, we need to be aware of the knowledge worker, that worker who's not producing something with their hands or a product each day, but who is using their mind to think through, solve problems, strategize. And for many of the people who are watching this, for many of us, we're in a job, we're in employment as a knowledge worker, where we have more time to think about our work. And in this shift in the workplace, we've also seen people think more about the purpose of their work. Why am I doing what I'm doing? I think culturally, we've seen a shift as well in society. We've seen where people found transcendent value and purpose in families. We've seen the breakdown of the family. We've seen divorce rate increase. We've seen systemic parentless, fatherlessness. And regardless of what we're looking at, and I'm just asking questions today, the question would be, has this change in the family structure affected where this generation or where people find purpose and transcendent value? And so is it possible that our workers of today, the knowledge workers, are looking for greater levels of purpose in the workplace? Now, what's also interesting is there are a number of other factors that we've talked about as a team that I would love to just raise. And I want to raise them as questions, which is why we titled this episode, Questioning Quiet Quitting. Because is it possible that the entire US workforce, and dare I say global, I don't know, do they actually react to financial markets? We see in the Gallup data that in 2007 and 2008, we had some of our highest actively disengaged employee scores. Was that due to the financial markets? Did the financial markets create a level of anxiety in our culture where people hold up? Those of us who need, when we're anxious, our cortisol levels increase. And what they've shown through tons of research is that in social support networks, when we're surrounded by people who care about us, it actually reduces our levels of cortisol, reducing our anxiety. And is it possible that in times of economic strain, anxiety in society increases, cortisol levels increase, people become isolated? That drives all of society into greater levels of anxiety. And ultimately, we see the effects in the workplace. Again, these are questions. I'd love it if you would send in your thoughts, your comments, maybe things that you've read to add to this. Is it possible that workplace engagement is affected by just the happiness of society? Are people happy? Are people stressed? Are people anxious? Is it possible that the media has an effect on the workplace? If the media is promoting stress, anxiety, tension between people, political tension, racial tension, international tension, whatever it might be, is it possible that tension, people read and watch, most people watching these days, see, does that affect my ability to go into the workplace and do my job well, with motivation, driven to perform more effectively? Is it possible that this is just a generational change and we just react to the prior generation? The boomers that were born until 1964 were reacting to the previous generation. The Xers reacting to the boomers. The Ys or the millennials reacting to their previous generation. And as these boomers reach kind of the end of their careers, do we have just a cultural shift that's affecting the workplace? A cultural shift of people who grew up understanding people more effectively, getting to participate in these management development courses, are now at odds and in conflict with a generation that hasn't had the opportunity. A generation that has grown up with technology and information at their fingertips, and also anxiety of changing markets, the shift in technology. Even back to international events, the Twin Towers, terrorism, wars, financial struggles. 2005 was a year of Hurricane Katrina. Lots of people affected by really environmental causes. So we think the rise of technology could also affect the workplace. What about suicide rates? Do we see suicide rates correlated to changes in the workplace and engagement? Has mobility created job change, quitting, the Great Resignation? We can get anywhere. We can get anywhere quickly. Many people don't live near family. Has that affected the workplace? Religious attendance. There was a time when transcendent purpose was gained through some form of religious affiliation. We know statistically that fewer and fewer people are actually attending religious gatherings on the weekend. Has that affected the workplace? So we're asking a number of questions today. The bottom line is, could it be that these factors are actually affecting the workplace more so than us just saying it's a generation of entitled people, lazy people who don't want to work? I'll just go out and say I don't believe that's true. I actually believe in this next generation. I believe this next generation is going to do incredible things in the workplace, but it's going to take another level of leadership and management to make that happen. You might be thinking in your head, why is it our responsibility? And I would say, I think that's the role of a manager. Like, if you want to manage people, then you need to care about them as people, not think of them like machines. And in some ways, the modern management theory, Taylorism, treated people like machines. If we can just scientifically engineer everyone's job to the greatest level of efficiency, then we get productivity and we get profit. The problem is with a knowledge worker, that doesn't exactly work. These are people. And so how do we create a workplace where we understand people? I also want to just share one other thought, and that is that I believe some of this conversation around the generations and quiet quitting is actually dramatically impacting the workforce more than we even know, simply talking about it. I want to explain to you the Pygmalion Effect, which in some ways came out of a study in 1968 of first grade students. They looked at these first grade students. They gave them an IQ test at the beginning of the year. Many of you have heard about this. And some people argue the efficacy of this, but I want to state it as a concept more than a truth. The concept is this. They gave these first grade students an IQ test, and they divided the students based upon their scores, high scores, low scores. And they divided those students into two classes. And they told the teachers, here are the students that scored higher. Here are the students in classroom 2 that scored lower. At the end of the school year, they had all those students in those 2 classes take the IQ test score or test again, and the students scored in alignment with their classrooms. Classroom 1 scored higher, classroom 2 scored lower. The question and the issue and the challenge to this was that the students weren't actually placed initially at the beginning of the school year based on their IQ scores. They were randomly assigned to classrooms. So classroom 1 was not higher scoring than classroom 2. It was a randomized assignment. But when we told the teachers that they were teaching to the higher scores and the lower scores, the teachers changed their expectations of the students. And when we change our expectations of people, they actually respond to our expectations. And that became known as the Pygmalion Effect, which says our belief about other people influences our actions towards them, which impacts their beliefs about themselves and causes their actions back towards us. And the cycle continues. What I want to say is the more that we talk about a generation, and when I say generation, I'm talking millennials and Gen Z, the more we talk about a generation who is quietly quitting, resigning, the great resignation, lazy, entitled, unrealistic expectations, the more that we state that, the more that people actually believe that, and the more it actually affects our actions towards this generation. I wasn't planning on doing this, but maybe I just need to challenge everybody who's watching this. What if instead of us just talking about the lazy generation, the entitled generation, these people who aren't loyal, who are quitting, who are looking for any way out, who switch every 2 years, who are all looking for new jobs, who want to become the CEO tomorrow? What if instead of complaining about them and promoting this concept because it sounds cute, what if we got busy actually understanding them, listening to them, taking the time to develop them? Really, we know that what people need more than anything is to feel valued by their organization, valued by their manager, and feel a sense of belonging. People want to be developed. They want to learn. They want to grow. I think if we would get busy developing managers who understood people more effectively, we might actually create workplaces that this generation thrives within. And so when you look at this data, what the Gallup organization is saying is, hey, we're not actually creating workplaces that this generation wants to be a part of. I mean, we know this to be true. The self-determination theory just says there's 3 psychological needs related to work: a sense of competence, like I'm doing a good job, autonomy in how I do my work, and positive and meaningful relationships. People want to be in a workplace where there's some transcendent purpose that they're working towards. When you just say, hey, my job is just to increase shareholder value for some unknown faces, particularly in a public company. In a private company, you might know the faces, but if it still is just about creating shareholder value, that ultimately doesn't drive me to want to do my job with motivation, with purpose, and perform at higher levels. Which leads us to 22-second TikTok videos, where we talk about a generation who's just quietly quitting. In other words, they're not actually quitting. They're just saying, you know what? This job doesn't actually motivate me to go above and beyond. But friends, we know that there are certain things that each one of us does where we're willing to go above and beyond. We're willing to do the extra thing, go the extra mile, spend the extra time, because we're passionate about it. We believe it will affect people. We believe it will help people. Whether you've served or traveled or given or you've helped somebody, we all know what this looks like. And we have a generation that wants to see more of this in the workplace. Now, you want to avoid people quietly quitting in the workplace? Well, in a recent article that I read, it talked about what motivates people and what leads them to greater commitment. There was a time when we could just pay people more. There was also a time when people felt the pressure of constantly changing jobs, and so they would stay in a job just so it didn't look bad on their resume. Neither one of those will keep people committed and motivated in work. Really, the only way to truly connect people to their work is through what they call effective commitment, which is connecting people to a greater purpose, connecting people to a culture, connecting people to some transcendent purpose and why they're doing what they're doing. Friends, I would just say this. There may be a number of factors that affect engagement of a generation, engagement of the workforce. But what we're talking about here are people who want to be valued, who want to do something with greater purpose. If we could more effectively as leaders and managers create environments that would connect people to some higher level of purpose, and then we would take the time to understand them, to talk to them, to treat them like human beings, to ask them how they're doing, to find ways of growing them, developing them, giving them opportunities. If we could find ways of helping them enjoy their work and feel autonomy in their work and be connected to a community, relationships, and people, it's possible that individuals would find greater purpose in their work, greater value in their work, and therefore they wouldn't be putting out 22-second TikTok videos on how they're quietly quitting and stepping away from their work at 5 p.m. Now, let me also say this. This is not about trying to convince people to work past 5 p.m. If you've really done your job well, you've done it effectively, and you've worked hard, and you've fulfilled the expectation and the commitment of your day, go home. Enjoy your time. We want you to have some sort of work-life integration. We love that for you. But my challenge to other generations who want to just call people things, state things, biases, we speak in generalities. Let's move away from that. It's not really doing anyone any good. In fact, I believe it's making matters worse. All right, there's enough of my rant. Questioning quiet quitting. I hope that you'll take the time to engage with me on this conversation. I'd love to hear questions, comments. Shoot, I'd even love it if you disagree with me. I'd love it if you'd leave some thoughts and we can interact with one another. But let's all just take a moment and question this idea of quiet quitting. My challenge to you would be, how do we help people find greater levels of commitment in the workplace? How do we help people find greater levels of purpose in the workplace that actually makes them better people, not just more productive workers? That's what we're after here at Always About People. That's the purpose of this show. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for watching. Whether you're watching this right now, whether you're watching this the week it was produced, or you're watching this as a recording, I would still ask that you leave comments, ask questions, engage in a dialogue. I didn't want this to just be a monologue. I hope you'll join us again as we continue to cover relevant topics here on the Always About People show. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.